The morning I decided to farm without a combine was a Tuesday in early March of 1988. I remember the air had that particular cold stillness that tells you the frost is still deep in the ground, but the sun has a little warmth in it for the first time since November. The sky was the colour of an old galvanised bucket, pale and flat, and the oaks on the fence row were still black and skeletal. It was the kind of quiet morning where a man can get to thinking, and that's not always a good thing. I was standing at the end of my lane, looking out over the 160 acres that had been in my family for 3 generations. It was good, dark ground. Not the best in the county, but honest ground. It would give you back what you put into it, provided you were paying attention. For the past 20 years, I'd farmed it like everyone else. Big tractor, bigger combine, corn one year, beans the next. You bought your seed from the co-op, your fertilizer from the chemical man, and you sold your grain to the elevator for whatever price they were paying that day. It was a system. It worked, mostly. But it felt like I was losing something, a little bit more each year. The soil was getting harder. The inputs were getting more expensive, and the margins were getting thinner than a worn-out dime. My wife, Martha, had passed 3 years before, and the house was quieter than it ought to be. The quiet gives a man room to think, and my thinking had led me to a decision that, by noon, had made its way to the diner in town and become the subject of some considerable speculation. The version the diner had was that I'd lost my mind. The version had grown. They said I was going to plough with horses. They said I was going to plant by the moon. The truth was a little less romantic and, to my neighbours, a lot more foolish. I'd bought a 1952 Alice Chalmers all-crop harvester, Model 60, paid $300 for it at an estate auction over in the next county. It had been sitting in a barn for 30 years, covered in dust and bird droppings, but the belts were still there, wrapped in burlap, and the canvas was folded neat on a shelf. The old man who died had kept it proper. I also bought a corn binder, a McCormick Deering, for another $100. It was seized up solid, but the steel was good. I spent that Tuesday morning unloading them off the flatbed with a chain hoist in the machine shed. That's when my neighbour Frank pulled up in his new Ford F250. It was the kind of truck that's too clean to be a farm truck, more of a statement than a tool. Frank is a good man, but he's a man who believes in progress, and progress to Frank comes with a warranty and a financing plan. He idled there at the end of the drive, the diesel making a low rumble that seemed to disapprove of the silence. He rolled down the window. He didn't get out. He just looked at the little orange harvester, then at me. "Morning," he said. He had a way of saying it that wasn't a question, more of a diagnosis. "Frank," I said, wiping grease from my hands onto a red rag. He nodded at the old crop. "Having a little fun with some old iron?" It was a polite way of asking what in the world I was doing. He knew I'd sold my big Case 1H combine the fall before. I'd gotten a good price for it, paid off the last of my equipment loans, and put the rest in the bank. The whole county knew it. They were all waiting to see what I'd buy to replace it. They assumed I was just waiting for the new models to come out. "I'm thinking of putting it to work," I said. I kept my voice flat. Frank's face didn't change, but a little stillness came over him. He was doing the math in his head. A man can't farm 160 acres with a pull-type harvester from 1952. Not corn and beans. The numbers don't work. The season's too short. The risk is too high. The data says it's impossible. "What are you doing with a corn binder?" he asked, his eyes shifting to the rusted machine sitting next to it. I told him I was farming, I said to myself, but out loud I just said, "Going to try something different this year." He was quiet for a long moment, the truck rumbling. He looked out over my empty fields, then back at the little machines that looked like toys next to the modern equipment in his sheds. "Well," he said, and it was the final word on the subject, "you'll be busy." He gave a short, polite nod, rolled up his window, and drove on. He didn't know what I knew, or rather, he didn't know what I was betting on. I didn't fully know myself, not yet. All I had was a memory and a small marble composition book with my father's careful handwriting on the inside cover. I hadn't looked at that notebook in 20 years. I'd put it away after he passed because I wasn't ready to read it. That Tuesday I knew it was time. I knew that the answer to Frank's unspoken question, the question everyone in town was asking, wasn't in the machine shed. It was in that book, and I had a feeling the land already knew it too. It was just waiting for me to catch up. The land is patient that way. It remembers things that men forget. It remembers the crops that grew here before the hybrids, before the chemicals, before the 700 horsepower combines that shake the ground. I didn't know it then, but the ground was waiting for a seed it hadn't seen in 40 years, and I was about to go looking for it. The truth is, my decision wasn't born on that cold Tuesday morning. It had been growing in me for years, a quiet little seed of doubt. It started with the soil. I'd walk my fields after a hard rain and see the water sitting on top, not soaking in. The ground was compacted, hard as a freight yard floor. My father used to say, the earth has to breathe. If it can't breathe, it can't give. Mine was holding its breath. The big equipment was to blame. Year after year, the weight of it pressing down, squeezing the life out of the topsoil. Frank and the others, they'd just buy bigger machines, more horsepower to rip through that compacted layer. They were fighting the ground, not working with it. I started remembering things my father had told me when I was a boy, things I had dismissed as old-fashioned. He never owned a combine. He used that same little all-crop 60 until the day he retired. He'd walk the fields in the evening, not with a clipboard and the soil probe, but with his hands, crumbling the dirt, smelling it. He talked about tilth and structure, words the young men from the university extension office didn't use anymore. They talked about nutrient units and yield projections. They had charts and graphs that could prove my father was inefficient. And for 20 years, I had believed them. After Frank left, I finished cleaning the bird nest out of the all crop. I started soaking the seized parts of the corn binder in penetrating oil. The work was slow, methodical. It felt good. It felt like I was fixing something, not just buying something new. That evening, I went into the house, washed up, and made myself a simple supper. The quiet of the kitchen was heavy. It was in these moments I missed Martha the most. She had a way of grounding my more fanciful ideas. She would have listened to my plan, her head tilted slightly, and then asked the one practical question that cut to the heart of it. How many acres are we talking about, John, and what does the banker say? But the banker was paid off, and the only person I had to answer to was myself. After dinner, I went to the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed. The air in the room was cool, and the only light came from the small lamp on the nightstand. I lifted the heavy lid, and the smell of cedar and old paper filled the space. Underneath a set of my mother's quilts and my old military uniform, there was a small, canvas-bound ledger and the marbled composition book. I took out the notebook. The corners were soft, worn down from writing in my father's pocket. The cover was faded. On the first page, in his perfect blocky script, it said, John Elias Rowe, his notes, 1946. My father was a man of few words, but he was a man who paid attention. The notebook was his memory. It was filled with planting dates, weather observations, harvest yields, page after page of small, precise details. He'd note the day the red-winged blackbirds returned, the depth of the frost on a particular morning, the price of a bushel of wheat and the mill. It wasn't a diary, it was data. It was the story of this farm, told in numbers and observations. I had read it once, years ago, and thought it was just a collection of old facts. Now I knew better. It was a set of instructions. I sat in the armchair by the window, the notebook open in my lap. I turned the pages slowly. He wrote about a variety of open-pollinated corn he favored, one he selected his own seed from each year. He wrote about a rotation that included red clover, plowing it under to build the soil.
The extension agent would have laughed at that, wasting a season on a cover crop. There was no money in clover. But my father wasn't farming for 1 year. He was farming for the next 50. He was farming for me. Then I found the page I was looking for. It was dated August 1955. He'd switched from wheat to soybeans a few years earlier, like everyone else, because the price was better. But he'd kept the small 4-acre plot of wheat, an old variety called Red May. It was a soft red winter wheat, not a high-yield hybrid. The entry was different from the others. It was less about numbers and more about observation.
He wrote, Red May stands tall. Stems are strong, hollow, good for bedding. The heads are heavy this year. Wind took a few. And then, at the bottom of the page, a single line, underlined twice. It was almost an afterthought, a question he was asking himself. Heads shatter easy with the all crop if ground speed is too high. But the straw is exceptional. Miller in town offered 5 cents a pound for the straw, baled clean. Check this. And next to it, a final cryptic note, circled in pencil. Never dug. I read that line a dozen times. Never dug. It felt important, a loose thread he'd never pulled. The price for the grain was just a commodity price, but 5 cents a pound for the straw in 1955 was a substantial amount. Straw was usually an afterthought, something you baled for bedding or just chopped and spread back on the field. Nobody paid a premium for it. But this miller had. Why? And what did never dug mean? Did it mean he never investigated the offer further? Or did it refer to something else? Something in the field itself? I closed the notebook and set it on the nightstand. I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The experts, the neighbours, they all saw an old man playing with old machines. They saw a fool who was giving up the efficiency of a modern combine. They saw a farm that was about to fail. They saw the risk. I was beginning to see the opportunity. I was betting on a dead man's question. I was betting on the idea that the value of a thing isn't always in the part everyone is looking at. My father used to say, the crowd is usually running the right way, but not always to the right place. I was about to turn around and walk in the other direction. I didn't know if I was right, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was farming my own ground again, not just borrowing it from the bank and the chemical company. I slept better that night than I had in years. The first problem, of course, was the seed. You couldn't just go down to the co-op and ask for Red May wheat. They hadn't sold anything but certified hybrid seed for 30 years. The man behind the counter, a young fellow named Kevin, with a degree in agronomy from the state university, would have looked at me like I was asking for a bag of dinosaur eggs. He'd pull out a catalog full of glossy pictures of short, stout wheat plants bred for maximum yield and disease resistance. Plants designed to be harvested by a 40-foot header moving at 7 miles an hour. Red May was the opposite of that. It was a tall, lanky plant, an old landrace variety that had been grown in this part of the country for 100 years before the hybrids came along. My search began where my father's notebook left off. The miller in town was long gone, the mill torn down in the 70s to make way for a dollar store. I spent a week on the phone. I called old farmers, men my father's age, who were either in nursing homes or cemeteries. The ones I could reach remembered the name, Red May, but nobody had grown it in decades. They'd all switched over. It was the sensible thing to do. The hybrids promised double the bushels per acre. They delivered too, but they didn't mention what was lost in the exchange. I called seed banks, university agricultural departments, and historical societies. Most of them had never heard of it. A few had a record of it, a line in a dusty old catalogue, but no actual seed. I was about to give up. I figured my whole plan was dead before it even started. I'd have to sell the old equipment for scrap and go, hat in hand, to the bank for another loan to buy a new combine. The thought made my stomach turn. I remember it was a Saturday and it was raining.
a cold, miserable drizzle that suited my mood. I was sitting at the kitchen table looking through my father's notebook again, hoping for another clue. That's when I saw it.
A name and a number, penciled in the back margin of a page about calibrating a grain drill. A. Peterson, Seed Savers. It was barely legible. I didn't know what Seed Savers was. I assumed it was just another dead end. But the phone number had a local area code. On a whim, I dialed it. An old woman answered, her voice thin but clear. I asked for A. Peterson. "Speaking," she said. I told her my name and that I was looking for a man who might have known my father. I explained I was looking for an old variety of wheat. She was quiet for a moment. "My husband was Arthur," she said. "He passed 10 years ago. He was a seed saver. He collected old varieties, kept them going." "What was the name of the wheat?" "Red May," I said. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line.
"Oh, yes," she said, and her voice warmed with memory. Arthur loved that one. He said it smelled like baking bread right in the field. He grew a small patch of it every year just to keep the seed alive. Said it was a crime to let it disappear. My heart started beating a little faster. Do you still have any of the seed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think so," she said. "He kept everything in the old spring house, labelled in little jars. I haven't been in there in years. If you want to come look, you're welcome to it. I can't imagine anyone else would have a use for it." That afternoon I drove the 10 miles to her farm. It was a place that time had forgotten. The house needed paint and the barn was leaning, but the yard was neat. She met me on the porch, a small, frail woman with bright, intelligent eyes. She led me to a stone spring house built into the side of a hill.
Inside, it was cool and dark, and it smelled of damp earth and old glass. Shelves lined the stone walls, and on them were hundreds of glass jars, each with a handwritten label. It was a library of seeds. We found it on the bottom shelf, a quart mason jar half full of small reddish-brown kernels. The label, in a careful looping script, said, "Red May Wheat, Harvest 1987. It was the last crop Arthur Peterson had grown. She wouldn't take any money for it. Arthur would have wanted it to be in the ground, she said, pressing the cool, heavy jar into my hands. He always said a seed isn't a seed until it's planted. Until then, it's just a promise. I drove home with that jar on the seat beside me like it was a treasure. It was more than a promise. It was a chance. I knew I didn't have enough seed for 160 acres. I didn't even have enough for one. I did the math. A quart of wheat is about 1.5 pounds. The recommended seeding rate for modern wheat is around 90 pounds per acre. I had enough to plant a garden plot. My first year wouldn't be a harvest. It would be a rescue mission. I would have to become a seed saver myself, just like Arthur Peterson. I spent the next month preparing a half-acre plot behind the house. I used my old two-bottom plow, the one I hadn't touched in 20 years. The work was slow. I didn't push it. I plowed, then disced, then harrowed, letting the ground rest between each pass. I could feel the soil coming alive again, loosening up. It was dark and crumbly, not the hard, pale dirt in the big fields. I was treating that half-acre like a garden. Frank drove by a few times, saw me on my little tractor, and just shook his head. He was already done with his spring planting, 1,200 acres of corn in the ground, all of it done with GPS and auto steer. I was still preparing a plot the size of a football field. By mid-April, the soil was ready. I waited for the right day, and day after gentle rain when the soil was moist but not wet. I used an old push seeder, the kind you use for a lawn, and I walked back and forth across that half-acre, sowing the seeds of red May wheat. It felt like a prayer. I had no idea if the seed was still viable. I had no idea if my plan would work. All I had was a jar of 40-year-old hope and a dead man's notebook. As I finished, I looked at the dark, empty plot. It looked like nothing. But I knew under the surface a promise was waiting. Now all I could do
was wait. The waiting is the hardest part of farming. You put the seed in the ground and then you have to trust. You trust the soil, you trust the sun, you trust the rain, and you trust the seed itself. You do what you can, you cultivate, you watch for pests, but mostly you wait. The red May was slow to germinate. For 2 weeks, the half-acre plot behind the house was just bare earth. I'd walk out there every morning, coffee in hand, and stare at the ground, looking for any sign of life. Nothing.
Frank had finished planting his beans by then. His fields were neat, precise rows of emerging green. My little plot was just a patch of brown. The gossip in town had moved on from amusement to pity. The consensus at the diner was that the old man had finally lost it. He'd sold a perfectly good combine, bought a pile of rust, and planted a dead seed. I'll own that I started to doubt myself. Every farmer knows the fear of a failed crop. It's a cold feeling in the pit of your stomach. I'd lie awake at night, listening to the wind, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. I'd think about the money from the combine sale, sitting in the bank, and wonder if I should just give up, buy some new equipment, and go back to farming the way everyone else did. It would be easier, safer. During those weeks of waiting, I spent my evenings with my father's notebook. I wasn't just looking for instructions anymore. I was looking for reassurance. I read his entries from years of drought and years of flood.
I read about early frosts and hailstorms that had wiped out half a crop. He never wrote about fear or doubt. He just wrote down what happened and what he did next. His entries were a testament to patience. He never rushed. He watched. He waited. He learned. One night, I found an entry from the spring of 1949. He'd had a late frost that had killed his first planting of corn. He wrote, "Ground is cold, lost the early corn, replanted on May 28th. The season will be short, but the ground knows what to do." That line stuck with me. The ground knows what to do. He trusted the land in a way I had forgotten how to. He saw it as a partner, not an adversary. The next morning I went out to the plot and I saw it, a faint, almost invisible tinge of green. I had to kneel down to be sure. Tiny, delicate blades of grass, no thicker than a thread, were pushing up through the soil. The red May was alive.
Over the next month, it grew with a strange, old-fashioned vigour. It didn't look like modern wheat. The hybrids are short, almost dwarfish, bred to put all their energy into the grain head. The red May was tall and slender. By June it was waist-high, and by July it was chest-high. The stems a pale silvery green, the heads nodding in the breeze. It looked more like a wild grass than a crop. It was beautiful. Frank stopped by one evening in mid-July. He leaned against the fence, looking at the patch of wheat. His own corn was shoulder-high, a dark, uniform green, a perfect factory floor of a field. "That's some tall-looking wheat," he said. It wasn't a compliment. In modern farming, tall means inefficient. It means the plant is wasting energy on the stem instead of the grain. It means it's more likely to lodge, to fall over in a storm, making it impossible to harvest with a combine. "It's an old variety," I said. "Doesn't look like much of a yield on it," he observed, squinting at the small, slender heads. "The heads are small." "They are," I agreed. I didn't tell him about the straw. I didn't tell him about my father's note. It wasn't time yet. It was my secret. My bet. "Well," he said, pushing himself off the fence, "hope you get your seed back at least." He meant it kindly. He was worried about me. He saw a man clinging to the past, making a sentimental mistake that was going to cost him dearly. He saw a failure in the making. I just nodded. "We'll see what the thresher says." The summer wore on. The wheat turned from green to gold. It stood tall and proud, a little island of the past in a sea of modern agriculture. I spent my days working on the old all-crop harvester and the corn binder. I took them apart, cleaned every piece, replaced the bearings, patched the canvas. I found an old manual online and learned the machine inside and out. It was a simple, elegant piece of engineering. It didn't have a computer or a single sensor. It worked on belts and pulleys and gravity. It was designed to be fixed by a farmer with a wrench and a bit of ingenuity, not a technician with a laptop. As I worked, I thought about that phrase from my father's notebook, never dug. It had become a kind of mantra for me. The extension agent had never dug deeper than the yield numbers. Frank had never dug deeper than what the co-op told him. For 20 years, I hadn't either. We were all farming the surface, the top line of the spreadsheet. My father had left me a clue, a hint that there was something more, something deeper to be found if you were willing to look. I was digging now, not with a spade, but with my time, my work, my attention. I was betting everything on that one cryptic note.
By early August, the wheat was ready. The stems were the colour of honey, and the heads were bowed, heavy with grain. It was time. Harvest was not a one-day affair, as it is with a modern combine. It was a process, a series of steps, each one slow and deliberate. First came the binder. The old McCormick Deering, which had been a block of rust in March, was now gleaming with new paint and oiled parts. I hitched it to my little tractor and drove it into the half-acre plot. The machine was fascinating to watch. A set of rotating arms gathered the tall stalks of wheat, a sickle bar cut them at the base, and then a mechanism bundled them together and tied them with a piece of twine. It would then kick out a perfect golden sheaf of wheat. It took me the better part of a day to cut that half-acre. The binder left the sheaves scattered across the field like sleeping soldiers. The next step was to stook them.
I went out with a pitchfork and gathered the sheaves into shocks, leaning them against each other so the heads could dry in the sun and air. It was back-breaking work. The sun was hot and the straw was scratchy. By the end of the day, my arms were covered in 1,000 tiny cuts and my back ached. I stood there, leaning on my pitchfork, looking at the 20 or so shocks standing in the golden stubble. It was a scene from 100 years ago. It was inefficient, it was slow, it was beautiful. The wheat shocks stood in the field for 2 weeks, drying and curing. The weather held, thank God. A single big thunderstorm would have flattened them, ruined the grain. But the days were hot and dry, and the nights were cool. I could feel the land working with me. Finally, it was time for the thresher. The little all-crop 60 was designed to pick up the sheaves directly from the field, but it was more efficient to bring them to the machine. I loaded the shocks onto a hay wagon and brought them over to the machine shed. I had spent the summer getting the thresher ready. Now it was time to see if it would work. I positioned the tractor, engaged the power takeoff, and the old machine came to life with a clatter of belts and a hum of turning shafts. It was a noisy, rattling contraption, but it had a rhythm to it. I took a deep breath and pitched the first sheaf into the feeder. The machine groaned, then chewed it up. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a stream of golden wheat kernels began to pour from a spout on the side, filling a metal bushel basket. Out of the back, a blower shot a cloud of clean, long-stem straw onto the ground. It worked. It actually worked. I spent the rest of the day feeding the shocks into the machine one by one. The pile of straw grew into a small mountain. The bushel baskets filled up with grain. It was a slow, dusty, noisy process, but I wasn't just harvesting wheat. I was harvesting a memory. I was proving something to myself.
When I was done, I had 7 full bushel baskets of red May wheat. That was about 7 bushels from a half-acre plot. A modern hybrid would have yielded 30 or 40. By that measure, Frank was right. It was a failure. But I wasn't looking at the grain. I was looking at the straw. The all-crop harvester with its gentle rubbing action had separated the grain without shattering the stalks. The pile on the floor of my machine shed was a mound of long, unbroken, golden straw. It was light and hollow and strong. It was exceptional, just as my father had written. I baled it carefully with my old square baler, making tight, neat bales. I ended up with 32 of them. The next morning, I loaded one of the bales into the back of my pickup truck and drove into the city. I wasn't going to the feed mill. I had made some calls.
My search for the straw's value had led me to an unlikely place, a company that supplied materials for historical building restoration. They were always looking for long stem straw for thatching roofs and mixing into traditional plaster. It was a niche market, one that the big farms couldn't be bothered with. I parked in front of a warehouse in an industrial part of the city. A man came out to meet me. He was older, with calloused hands and a skeptical look in his eye. He was the owner, a man named Peters. He was the quiet, validating expert, though I didn't know it at the time. "You're the one who called about the wheat straw?" he asked. I nodded. "Let's see what you've got." I dropped the tailgate and he came over to the bale. He didn't just glance at it, he studied it. He pulled a long stem from the bale and held it up to the light. He bent it, testing its strength. He broke it and looked at the hollow core. He ran his hands over the bale, feeling its texture, its cleanness. He was quiet for a long time. The silence stretched on. I could hear the traffic on the nearby highway. I was sure he was going to tell me it was worthless. Finally, he spoke. He didn't look at me. He looked at the straw. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low. "I grew it," I said. "Red May wheat." He nodded slowly, still examining the stem in his hand. "Haven't seen straw like this in 30 years, he said. "Not since the old-timers quit. Everything now is short stem, bred for the combine. It's useless for our work. It just turns to dust." He dropped the stem and looked at me for the first time. "It's clean, no chaff, unbroken. This is substantial." That was the word. Substantial. It was a quiet word, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap. It was the validation I had been waiting for all year. "What's it worth?" I asked. He named a price per bale that was 4 times what a bale of ordinary straw would sell for at the feed mill. I did the math in my head. The 32 bales from my half-acre plot were worth more than the 30 bushels of modern wheat I could have grown there. The straw, the part everyone else threw away, was the real harvest. "I had 31 more bales at home," I told him. He just nodded. "I'll take all of it," he said. "And I'll take whatever you can grow next year, too." I drove home that afternoon feeling a sense of quiet triumph. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the notebook. It was about my father's quiet observation, his unanswered question. It was about trusting something old and slow in a world that only valued new and fast. I hadn't just harvested a crop. I had harvested an idea. I had my seed for next year. 7 bushels, enough to plant about 8 acres. The rescue mission was over. Now the real work could begin. The following spring, I didn't just plant a half-acre garden plot. I prepared 10 acres of my best bottomland ground. I used the same slow, careful methods, ploughing and disking, giving the soil time to breathe. I planted my saved red May seed, and this time I knew what I was watching for. The wheat came up strong and thick, a beautiful sea of green that slowly turned to gold over the summer. The 10 acres looked like a picture from an old book, the tall wheat waving in the wind. Frank was busy with his 1,200 acres of corn and beans. He was having trouble that year. It was a wet spring, and he had to replant 100 acres of corn that had rotted in the ground. Then it turned dry in July, and the tassels on his corn started to burn up. His crop looked stressed, uneven. My wheat, with its deep roots, didn't seem to mind the dry weather. It just kept growing. My father used to say, "The old seeds remember the old weather." Maybe he was right. The harvest that year was a monumental undertaking. 10 acres is a lot of ground to cover with a binder and a thresher. I hired a couple of high school kids from town to help me stook the sheaves. They thought it was a strange summer job, but they were good workers. We spent a week cutting and shocking, leaving the 10-acre field dotted with hundreds of golden teepees. Then came the threshing. It took another 2 weeks. We set up the all-crop harvester by the barn and created an assembly line. The boys would load the sheaves onto the hay wagon in the field, drive it up to the machine, and I would feed the thresher while they went back for another load. The pile of straw grew into a mountain. The grain poured out of the spout, filling wagon after wagon. It was a slow, noisy, dusty celebration. By the end of it, we had 5 full gravity wagons of clean, red gold wheat, and a barn stacked to the rafters with bales of perfect, long-stemmed straw. The yield was, as Frank had predicted, low. I got about 15 bushels to the acre. Modern wheat would have given me 60 or 70. But I wasn't selling my grain to the elevator. I'd done some research. I found a small, organic grist mill 2 counties over that specialized in heirloom grains. The owner was a young woman who was passionate about baking. I took her a sample of the red May. She ground it into flour, right there in front of me. The smell was incredible, nutty and sweet. She baked a small loaf of bread while I waited. It was the best bread I had ever tasted. She offered me a price for my grain that was 3 times the commodity price of the local elevator. She wanted the story as much as the flour. She wanted to be able to tell her customers that her bread was made from a wheat that had almost disappeared, grown by an old farmer on a piece of family land. The wagons rolled out the next day, headed from the grist mill. 5 full wagons. It was a beautiful sight. That evening, as I was finishing up, cleaning the chaff out of the thresher, Frank pulled up in his Ford. He didn't stay at the end of the lane this time. He pulled right up to the machine shed, got out, and walked over. He looked at the mountain of straw bales, the clean-swept floor where the wagons had been, and then at me. He was quiet for a long time. His own harvest had been disappointing. The dry weather had cut his corn yield by 1/3. He'd be lucky to break even. "Heard you got a good price for that flour wheat," he said finally. It wasn't a question. News travelled fast. "I did all right," I said. He kicked at a loose piece of straw on the ground. "And the straw?" "Did all right on that too," I said. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw not pity or amusement in his eyes, but a grudging respect. He didn't understand it, not really. It went against everything he knew about modern farming, about efficiency and scale and progress. But he couldn't argue with 5 full wagons and a barn full of valuable straw. He couldn't argue with the numbers. "Huh," he said. It was a small sound, but it held a world of meaning. It was his concession, his admission that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as wrong as he thought. "You might not be as wrong as I thought," he said, almost to himself. He nodded, got back in his clean truck and drove away. That was the victory. Not the money in the bank, not the full wagons, but that one quiet moment of acknowledgement from a man who had been so certain I was a fool. It was the quiet concession, the thing you work for, the thing that says you were right to listen to the old voices. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my father's notebook. I turned to the page from 1955, the one with the underlined sentence about the straw. I took out a pencil, and next to his circled, cryptic note, "Never dug," I wrote 2 words of my own. Dug. Found. It felt like I was finishing a conversation that had started 30 years before. I had finally answered his question. The value was in the thing that was overlooked. The profit was in the patience. It was in listening to the ground, to the seed, to the quiet wisdom of a man who had paid attention. My father had left me more than a farm. He had left me a map. I just had to learn how to read it. The lesson of the red May wheat wasn't just about straw. It was about seeing the whole picture. For years, I had been farming like everyone else, focused on a single number, bushels per acre. It's a simple, seductive metric. It's easy to measure, easy to brag about at the diner. We'd all been chasing that one number, and in the process, we were missing everything else. We were treating the ground like a machine, a factory floor for producing a single commodity. We poured in chemicals and expensive seed,
and we drove bigger and bigger machines to get that number to go up, even by a fraction. But the land isn't a factory. It's a living system, complex and interconnected. And value isn't always found in the place the market tells you to look.
My father's note about the straw was a clue. It pointed to a different way of thinking. He was looking at the whole plant, the grain and the stalk. He was stacking enterprises. He saw two crops where everyone else saw only one. The real revelation for me, though, was that circled phrase, never dug. It haunted me. Why hadn't he? He was a careful man, a thorough farmer. It wasn't like him to leave a profitable stone unturned. I spent a lot of time thinking about that. I think I finally understand. In 1955, the world was changing. The post-war boom was on. The message from the universities, from the government, from the magazines was all about modernization. Get bigger, get more efficient, specialize. The old ways were sentimental, inefficient. The future was in chemicals, hybrids, and horsepower. My father was caught between two worlds. He saw the potential in the old ways, in the forgotten value of something like long-stem straw. But the tide of progress was too strong. His neighbours were all buying new combines, planting the new miracle seeds. The miller who valued his straw was probably the last of his kind. To pursue that niche market would have meant swimming against a powerful current. It would have meant being the odd man out, the one they laughed at. And so, he didn't dig. He stuck with what was safe, what was accepted. He put the notebook away and bought a bigger tractor. He didn't make the leap that I made 30 years later. I don't blame him for that. He had a family to feed, a son to raise. He couldn't afford the risk. But he left the note. He left the question for someone else to answer. It was a gift, a little piece of unfinished business passed from his generation to mine. I was lucky. I was at a different stage of my life. I was alone. I had no debts. I could afford to fail. I could afford to be laughed at. I could take the risk he couldn't. And in doing so, I didn't just find a profitable crop. I found a new way to farm, a way that felt right, a way that was healing the land instead of just using it. The next year, I planted 30 acres of red May. The year after that, 60. I never went back to corn and beans. I found other old seeds in Arthur Peterson's collection. An open-pollinated corn with a rich, oily germ that was perfect for cornmeal. A variety of black bean that the fancy restaurants in the city were willing to pay a premium for. Each one required a different kind of attention, a different kind of harvest. My farm became a mosaic of old varieties, a living museum. I never bought a new combine. The little Old Crop 60 is still my primary harvesting tool. I've bought a few more, for parts. I have a small crew of people who help me now. Young people mostly, who are interested in a different way of farming. They come here to learn about the old seeds, the old machines, the old ways. They don't see it as backward. They see it as a way forward. Frank is still my neighbour. He's still farming his 1,200 acres, with the biggest, newest equipment money can buy. Some years he does very well. Some years, when the weather or the markets turn against him, he struggles. We're friendly. We talk over the fence. He doesn't make jokes about my old iron anymore. He asks questions. He's curious. Last fall, he asked me if I had any of that long straw to spare. He wanted to use it for bedding for his daughter's show cattle, said the stuff he got from the co-op was too dusty. I gave him 20 bales. He tried to pay me for them. I wouldn't take his money. It was enough to see his big, clean truck driving away with a load of my old-fashioned straw in the back. The land has changed. The soil in my fields is darker now, richer. It smells alive. After a rain, the water soaks right in. The earthworms are back. I'm putting more back than I'm taking out. I'm building something. My father's notebook sits on my nightstand. I still read it. Not for instructions anymore, but for the company.
It's a reminder that we're all just part of a long story, each of us farming in the shadow of those who came before. They leave us the land, and if we're lucky, they leave us a few good questions. The difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention. My father was paying attention. He saw the value that others were starting to miss. He just ran out of time to dig for it. I'm glad I did. It's been the best work of my life. If you've got your own piece of overlooked ground, your own piece of old iron, your own stubborn idea that the experts tell you is wrong, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Let me know what you found when you decided to dig. Subscribe if this meant something to you. There's a lot of wisdom buried just under the surface, if you're willing to slow down and look for it.